Welcome to our next lesson where I'm going to introduce you to Refit and how to use it to automatically generate HTTP clients. We're going to rewrite our example with integrating with the GitHub REST API using Refit, and you'll see what the differences are between using the native HTTP client in .NET and using the Refit approach. If you haven't heard of it before, Refit is a very popular library in .NET, and it brands itself as the automatic type-safe REST library. You can scan the documentation to see some initial examples of how to get started, but there's a lot more here when it comes to working with Refit and some of the advanced features. Now I'll try to showcase the most important things as we go through our demo. So what I want to do as part of this lesson is recreate our GitHub service and remove the dependency from the HTTP client factory and instead use Refit. Now, in order to do this, we have to start by installing the Refit library. So let me go ahead and add some NuGet packages. I'll browse for Refit, and the libraries that I want to install are Refit HTTP client factory. Let me go ahead and add the latest version. And I'm also going to install Refit Newtonsoft JSON because this is the serializer that I will be using. The HTTP client factory library will give us a very easy way to configure Refit interfaces as HTTP client implementations. You'll see how this looks like in just a moment. So now that we have Refit installed, how do we actually use it? Well, you need to define an interface that's going to represent your Refit client. I'll create a new type and I'll make sure that it's an interface, and I will call it the iGitHub API. And I want to mimic the API surface that I already have in the GitHub service. So I'm going to copy what I have here and use that as the basis for my interface definition. So I'll need the access token and a cancellation token. Now I will simplify the names of these endpoints a little. I'll omit the async suffix, so I'll just say get user profile as the method. It will still be returning a GitHub user profile DTO, but what I want to do is wrap this in an API response, which is a type from Refit, and this will give me some additional control when working with my API responses. For example, I can check if this is a successful result or not. I can handle exceptions, so it's very practical in that regard. Then you need to decorate your method with one of the HTTP methods that you want to be using. In our case, we want to use the getHTTP method, and this will allow us to specify the URI where we should be sending this request. In our previous example, we were hard-coding this here when sending the GET request using the HTTP client, and with Refit, we make that part of the route using the getHTTP method attribute. What about the access token? Well, for this, we're going to decorate it with the authorize attribute, which is coming from the Refit namespace, and here we can specify the bearer scheme, and this will automatically append this as the authorization header when sending API requests. Using this simple attribute replaces what we had here, where we manually added the authorization header to our HTTP client. So you can already see how Refit is saving us some lines of code. What about our second method that we were calling, which fetches the events for the user? Well, here is all we have to do to replace this. I'll define a new method called getUserEvents. It's going to return an API response containing a list of GitHub event DTOs. This is what we were already doing. Then I'll specify the username, and notice that in this case, I'm using a route parameter in my get attribute. So Refit is able to translate the parameters that I pass into my method as route parameters in the URI. I'm also specifying an access token, and any other value that I didn't map to a route parameter is going to be mapped as a query parameter. So in this case, I'm passing in the page and the page size, where I can even alias the parameter names that I have in my code with how they should be constructed in the URI. Now, what about some default request headers that we were including with our HTTP client? Let me go to dependency injection, and I will find the add application services method. Here, we were configuring our GitHub client as a named client, setting the base address, but we were also including the user agent and the accept headers with some default values. In order to achieve this with Refit, we'll decorate the entire GitHub API interface with the headers attribute, and here I can pass in the headers that I want to include in all of my API requests as individual values. So I'm passing in the user agent header, which has a value of devhabit version 1.0, and the accept header, which uses the GitHub custom media type as its value. So this one line of code replaces everything we have here. And now all that's left is to register Refit as an API client. So how do we do this? Well, I have to say builder, services, and instead of calling add HTTP client, I will say add refit client. Now this also has a generic overload that's going to accept the iGitHub API interface. I can also pass in a refit settings object where I can set the content serializer that I want to use for this HTTP client, and I'm going to use the Neutronsoft JSON serializer. I can also configure the HTTP client by chaining an additional method call, and I'm just going to use this opportunity to set the base address for my client. So I'm going to copy what I had here and paste it below, and this entire setup now comes down to just this. So this takes care of our HTTP client. Now I have to rewrite the GitHub service to use the refit client instead. So what I'm going to do is copy this type, and inside of the copy type, I'm going to rename it to refit GitHub API service. So let's start replacing this one step at a time, and I'm going to start by injecting the GitHub API interface as the abstraction. I'm also going to get rid of this method here because we won't need it, and now I need to fix my implementations of the two methods that I have on this service. So I'm going to drop in the updated version and walk you through what I have here. All we have to do now is just use the GitHub API to call the respective method. This will send an HTTP request and wrap it in an API response. On the response, I can check if it's a success status code or not. If it's not, I'm going to log the error and return null. Otherwise, I can return my content. Notice that I don't have to serialize the response. It's already taken care of by refit. And now let me update my second method here. So just a comparison of what we had before. We were creating an HTTP client. We were constructing the URI, checking if the response status code was successful or not. And we also had to take care of serializing the response. Now all of this can become just this, where I call the GitHub API and I achieve the same behavior that we had before. So this is what my implementation will look like with refit. Now I need to register this service with dependency injection. Let's, for example, add it right here. I'll say refit GitHub service, and then we just have to use our new implementation. So I will go to the GitHub controller, and I'm just going to replace GitHub service with refit GitHub service. And you will notice that our method where we are using this, the getUserProfile method, is working the same as before, and this is because I maintain the same API surface. So now let's go ahead and test this out and just confirm that everything is working the same as before. I'll send a GET request to fetch the user's profile, and this assumes that we already have a personal access token stored inside of the application. Now if I send this request, you'll see we get back a 200 OK response, and we get the user's profile the same as before. Now let's send the same request again, and I'll add a breakpoint in our controller. You can see we land on this breakpoint, and what I wanted to show you is the GitHub service, or rather the GitHub API when we step into this method. If you take a look here, you can see the name of this type. It's refit implementation generated dev habit API service iGitHub API. If I go ahead and do a type search for this type, I'll be able to take a look at the auto-generated code, and this is the class that refit generates based on my interface definition. So here you can see the HTTP client setup, the implementations for our interface methods, and it also takes care of any serialization and other stuff automatically for us. So this is how the source generator works. So I'm going to press continue, and we'll get a response back in Postman, but let's get back to our code. A couple of improvement points that we could make here is move the route definitions into some constants. Using refit can be a very interesting option for automatically generating your HTTP clients. I've been using this library for many years with a lot of success, and I highly recommend that you consider it whenever you need to integrate with an external API. All you have to do is define a respective interface, and you can start sending API requests. Now, if you need to support some other HTTP methods, you can just use the respective attributes. So there's the post attribute, the put attribute. You can also specify delete, and of course patch is supported. So you are not just limited to sending GET requests. When you are sending post, put, or delete requests with a request body, these will be automatically serialized from your arguments, and you can even specify an object type here instead of using primitive types, and refit takes care of properly serializing the request body. So I think this definitely simplifies my GitHub API integration, and I'm also going to update my background job to use the refit GitHub service. So let me go into my jobs, and the one I want to update is the GitHub habit processor job. I'm just going to replace GitHub service with refit GitHub service, and everything will work the same as before because my API surface is identical. And I think I'm going to wrap up this lesson here about automatically generating HTTP clients. I demonstrated how you can use Refit to integrate with the GitHub REST API, and you saw that our integration works the same as before, while we had to write a bit less code than when we were using the HTTP client. In our next lesson, I want to continue this discussion by talking about HTTP resilience and using Polly to implement this.